It was a very hot day in October, much hotter than the couple thought it was going to be when they planned an outdoor wedding. And as the groom had already sweat through his clothes, he and I were standing baking in the sun, sweating profusely as the bride was on her way. And I heard him say ever so quietly, "I'm not sure if I'm okay." Now, I eventually figured out, I think he was getting dehydrated. But for just a moment, I thought what he was saying was, "I don't know if I should be getting married." Now, this is the thing, right? When you're planning a wedding, it's plans, it's hopes, it's picking out invitations. But when you're standing there getting ready to say yes, it's about to, what we would say, get real. And I thought that he was saying it's about to get real and I don't know if I'm ready. Mostly he was just sweating a lot. But this happens in other ways too. I can remember when we bought our first house, spent a year looking at these old brick Victorian homes in St. Louis. If they were in good shape, we couldn't afford them. If they were not in good shape, we didn't want to move a little child into them. And we ended up finding the next neighborhood over this house. It looked like a gingerbread house kind of. It had this just brick front. It was amazing. And we walked around it and we could imagine our oldest being in his room and turning the other one into a nursery someday. We could see our living room furniture where it was going to be. But when we sat down to sign that multi-page document with all the zeros of the money you're about to borrow, then it got real, right? We have this idea that things get real, but it's not always just events. My first summer job was at a swimming pool. I worked in the concession stand and as a cashier, letting people into the pool. And I got to observe lifeguarding as a job because I was just around a lot. And at this particular pool, there were several lifeguard stands and they would rotate, I think about every 15 minutes. One would go take a break and then 15 minutes later, one would come back off a break. Most of lifeguarding is just sitting around, watching, right? Every once in a while, stop running to the little kid that's running on the deck, or you two, knock it off, wrestling in the water. I'm going to make you get out if I have to tell you again. But most of lifeguarding is just that. Sitting there watching, a little bit of preventative pointing out of things that are unsafe. Well, at the end of the lanes you could swim laps in, there was a big concrete grandstand. And one day I was up pulling weeds, and I heard lots of whistles, like 3 long whistles, I think it was. And I turned around and I could see down into the deep end, and a lifeguard was pulling a little guy out. And I later found out that he had jumped off the little low dive. His head made it up the first time, but it didn't make it up the second time, and he wasn't making it progress towards the edge. So the lifeguard jumped in and pulled him out and saved his life. Now, most of lifeguarding is a real job where you're doing the lifeguarding thing, but when you have to jump in the water and save a kid, it gets real fast. Real because you really did just save a life, not just watching and blowing the whistle, but all of that fits into that role of being a lifeguard. Today we have 2 Bible texts that are really about what it means to follow Jesus, and they get real. The gospel, Jesus tells us you have to hate your family, hate your life, and give away everything that is yours. He frames it, though, in a calculation of the cost of being a disciple. He says if you're going to build a tower, you would sit down and make sure you have enough to build it. If you're going to go to war as a king, you always check to make sure there's a reasonable degree of success before you go do that. And what he seems to be saying then is if you're going to be a disciple, you should understand at the beginning what it's going to cost. And it may cost you your family, it may cost you your life, and it may cost you everything that is yours. And that is what it's going to take. Now, even as Jesus says this, I want to make sure that we put this text in its right place. Because Jesus made all those calculations. Jesus came into the world to reconcile the whole creation with God. And what was the cost of that? His life. He made that calculation. He knew that to make us right with God, to bring us righteousness, to give us life, that he had to die. And not like a pleasant death in his sleep at an old age, but a horrible, torturous death. And he knew that cost, but he also knew that the promise at the other side of it was life. And so he willingly took on that cost, knowing that the end result would be life for all of us. Now, there's lots of ways we talk about that. Sometimes we talk about it as a place of heaven that we're headed to. Sometimes we talk about it as eternal life, which we can have even now. However we talk about it, salvation, all of that is Jesus' work, and he has already done it. Can we earn it? That should be a quick no, right? Can we earn God's love? No. No. All right. Can we earn God's love? Yes. No. No, we cannot. We are saved by grace through. What can we do to earn that? Nothing. Okay. This should be an easy one, right? So we can do nothing to earn God's love. Jesus already did all that work. So when we read this text today, these couple of stories about discipleship, we are not talking about how we relate to God and how we get to God's love. It starts with the understanding that that is already ours. Discipleship is about how we respond to this gift of grace and this gift of life and love that we have already been given. So we have to start with that place of God's got us, we are beloved children of God, and there's nothing we can do to change that. So understanding that, then we come to Jesus talking about how hard it is to respond to that and what it means to follow him. And there is, in my mind, really no better example than the letter to Philemon. And if you track this letter to Philemon from the beginning, it sounds a lot like the story of a lifeguard, right? The lifeguard is there a lot, just paying attention, doing some good work until it gets real, and then a life has to get saved. And if you pay attention to the early part of this letter, Paul says to Philemon, hey, great job. And he's writing it to this he says, you got people meeting in your house as the church, and you have refreshed people's hearts. And I have heard about your faith, and I give thanks for everything that you do. And you get the sense early in this letter that Philemon's doing a pretty good job being the church. It sounds like he's hosting the church in his house. He's equipping people to be the church, and he has provided places for people to have their hearts refreshed in Jesus. And Paul is even saying, imagine what more we're going to do with Jesus. So the early part of this letter is praising Philemon for the work he's already doing as the church. And then it turns a corner and gets real, because Philemon has a slave. And the slave's name is Onesimus, and we don't really hear in this letter how Onesimus got to Paul, but Paul is in prison. Discipleship got real for Paul a long time ago, when he got blinded and then healed, and now he's in prison. It's not the only time he's going to be in prison. And so for Paul, it's all real. And yeah, he sounds joyful. You wouldn't think prison is a place where he feels joyful, but this is how Paul is freed in Christ, is that he can be in prison. Discipleship has gotten real. His life has been demanded of him, and he's writing joyful letters to other people about how wonderful the work of Jesus is. So Paul, as discipleship has gotten real, has been served by Onesimus, and he sends him back. And he says, all right, Philemon, nice job being a disciple. Good job as a lifeguard sitting on the stand and blowing the whistle now and again. But now it's about to get real. He says, I could command you to do this, but that's not how the gospel works. It's always an invitation. And so I'm inviting you to free your slave. Let him go free. Not only that, but welcome him back as what? A brother. Welcome him back as a brother. Free your slave. Welcome him back as a brother. It's an invitation to let him go free. Now, Paul is literally in jail, but feels free. I would almost bet that Onesimus, because of his time with Paul, also probably feels free in his spirit, right? But physically, he's still a slave. And so Paul is inviting Philemon to give him life, like a new life, a free life, no longer as a slave in a culture where that was the bottom, but to welcome him back as a brother and as a full member of community. This is Paul saying to him, jump off of that lifeguard stand into the water and let your discipleship get real. Because Philemon probably was able to do much of what he had already done without any real impact to himself. He could host a church in his house. He maybe could feed them all. He could refresh other people's hearts and still at the end of the day not have sacrificed any of his own comfort. But somewhere in letting your slave go, there's going to be an impact. And whether it's an impact to him economically or in the way he is seen by his neighbors, this is a big deal that Paul is asking him to do this. And I think that this story, the reason I like it so much is because I think it really probably ought to speak to most of us. I think if Paul wrote us a letter today, he could say, hey, you wonderful people at Salem Lutheran Church, I have heard about what you all are doing. I have heard about the way people can find rest when they come among you and you let them be who they are. I have heard about their hearts that are refreshed. I have heard about the way you have responded to needs in your community in little ways and big ways. I have heard about the ways that you are faithful. And we could all then say, yes, thank you for noticing, Paul. We've been trying to be faithful. But then he might turn the corner and say, all right, let's let it get real now. Now, what would that look like for us? I don't know that we can answer that question as a collective. Maybe we can, but it's probably, like in this case, he's writing to Philemon. It's a question for each of us to maybe wrestle with, right? Because in the gospel, when Jesus talks about hating your life and giving up all of your possessions, I don't think any of us have given it all up yet, but there is an invitation to be generous until it actually has an impact on our finances. There is an invitation to let go of our grudges and maybe let forgiveness be a thing. There is an invitation to maybe reorder our lives for the sake of the lives of others. And that is an invitation, not a command, right? It's an invitation in the gospel for us to let discipleship get real. And that's scary. It's scary if it's the financial side of it. It's scary if it means we have to enter into hard conversations with people and talk about forgiveness. It's scary if we have to reach out to people that are different from us, but who have lives that are at stake and the ways that we might enter into those places. And so, as we hear this invitation, I think it's important to know that the invitation is always an invitation to life. And if you listen to the rest of that letter and the way that Paul talks about Onesimus, the guy sounds amazing. He says, here, I'm sending this guy back to you. But then what does he call him? Did you hear it? He says, I'm sending you back Onesimus, my heart. So Onesimus has had such a big impact in serving Paul that Paul says, I'm sending you my heart. Not only that, Paul, who's in jail, says, if he owes you anything, charge it to me. I'm writing you a letter with my own hand. I'm going to get out of here. Save a room for me. I'm going to come back and pay you back. Onesimus has been a huge blessing to Paul. And what he's saying to Philemon is, if you take this risk of letting discipleship get real, it's going to change your life. It's going to change your life in ways that you can't even understand, because Onesimus is going to come and be this huge blessing to you, just as he has been to me. And then I'm going to come check it out, is what Paul is saying, right? Save a room, because I want to see what God is up to when Onesimus comes back to you. And I think then this is the same invitation for us, is to say, when we get that opportunity for let discipleship get real, as scary as it might be, it will transform our lives. And I have seen it happen. I've seen someone who went to India and was so touched by what they saw God doing, sold their house to get a smaller one so they could give more money to that ministry that was happening. I've seen people give up their garage space to collect furniture for refugee families, and not just their garage space, but their time to help begin resettling refugees in their community over and over again, because it really touched their lives. I've seen people adopt special needs children who have huge medical issues and whose life expectancy is not long, but adopt them anyway and give their hearts to these kids, knowing that their hearts are probably going to be broken as death comes and as these medical bills come that they have no expectation of being able to afford. I've seen people walk into the dark places of the world with forgiveness because they needed to for themselves, but also then took that risk of letting discipleship get real that they could walk alongside someone else. I don't know what that's going to look like for each and every one of us, but what I do trust is that the gift of life that Jesus has given us sits in those places where discipleship gets real. It looks like sacrifice. It looks like ridiculous generosity. When we were talking to the kids, and I said, can you give away all your possessions? They said, that sounds crazy, but it does sound like something Jesus says. Right. And that is the path of life. So as Onesimus comes back and Philemon is invited into this place of life by letting discipleship get real, it's just like that lifeguard jumping into the water. Do we have water in this place? Yes. Today we're going to baptize 3 little ones. And we talk about this water as dying so that we might come to new life. That day that I stood on that grandstand, I saw a kid yanked out of the water and set back in a place of life. And I think that's a great image for us, right, in our own baptisms, is that we get yanked out of that water and set in this place of life to let discipleship get real. But then we're also like a lifeguard, right? We can go along in our faith and just sit on the stand and blow the whistle every now and then. But I think the world doesn't need us so much to be pointing out rules at the pool as much as it does to jump into the water full bore again and start pulling people out that are in need of like literal saving. Jesus already saved them, remember, right? Jesus did all that work, but we can go into those places where people are starving and lonely and abused and broken and struggling to get by, and we can help pull them out of that water. And when we do that, we will discover that life has been there with us all along, this gift that Jesus has given us. If discipleship can get real with us, it will impact lives and transform us along the way. Amen.